Hello everyone. So in this video, we're going to talk about color. Color is one of the most important choices that we make when we are designing our website, and just small differences in the colors we choose can have huge impact on the perception of our website and how professional it looks. We're going to describe what color actually is, how we perceive and process it, see how that lets us derive different systems for mixing colors and identifying colors, and then look at a couple techniques for creating color palettes, whole arrays of color that we can use when we are building our website. We'll finish up with a couple tips on how to effectively use these palettes, and hopefully we will get you a nice quantitative set of rules you can use to derive colors that will look good enough for your websites. So I want to start by talking about what color is. Color is light. It is our perception of light. In your eye, you've actually got these cone cells. Looks almost like a spiral of soft serve ice cream up top with just a nerve dangling on the bottom. And these cones come in 3 different sizes. They're very short cones that are able to detect short wavelengths of light, very high number frequency light. This is colors at the end of the rainbow, like violet, like blue. Then we've got medium cones that are good in the middle range, the yellows and the greens. And finally, very, very long, highly stacked cones that are good at detecting reds, oranges, yellows. And when you actually have light enter your eye, the amount of each of these cones that are firing, how frequently they're firing, how much light they're collecting, that's what determines what color you see in your brain once it processes all this information. And as we see in this chart here, there is some overlap. Medium cones and long cones, they both can see things in this green range. So actually what the color green is for us in our eye is both of those firing at the same time. If we have this like yellow color right here, that means our green specialized cone and our red specialized cone, they're both firing in a certain proportion, and that's what makes us see the color yellow. So we've kind of got these 3 frequencies that we can measure, and then the brain has to summarize that, distill it down into something that we actually see. So there is one interesting note about this. Light usually doesn't fire off in single frequencies. Normally we are seeing a bunch at once. And there are actually 2 different ways that we end up seeing these when we are mixing colors. The most direct way is if we had something like colorful lights and we were shining those lights on top of each other. We are seeing exactly those frequencies right in our eye. If I shoot a green laser light at your eye, you're going to say, there's green light in my eye. That is the frequency right here detected by that medium cone being picked up as the light reaches your eye. So with positive color, this is called, because we're actually adding those frequencies in, typically if we want to mix colors together, we're going to use the primaries, the 3 positive primaries that represent these 3 cones directly: red, green, and blue. If we mix all of them together at once, if all 3 of them are firing, we end up perceiving that as white. And that's why if we go look at something like the sun, which is firing on every frequency all at once, we end up seeing that as white light. On the other hand, traditional art usually doesn't work with light directly. Normally, the Mona Lisa is not projected on a screen. It was painted with pigments, with inks, with other physical ingredients. So when these ingredients produce color, what we're actually seeing is all of the colors that ingredient did not absorb. materials have certain reflectiveness of certain colors. Red ink is actually ink that absorbs all of the higher frequencies, all of the greens and the blues. Those get absorbed, they actually turn into heat. And then just the red ones get reflected back, bounce off of red ink, and that's what comes into our eye, that red light that bounces off. Interestingly, what that means is when we're mixing these colors together, we actually kind of have the opposite of what we have with light. If I shine red light and green light at you at the same time, you're seeing both of those. If I mix red paint and green paint, we end up absorbing both of those colors. All of the things, the greens and the blues that the red paint absorbed, they still get absorbed. The greens and the reds that the blue paint absorbed, they also get absorbed. So if I mix red and blue, I end up with a much, much darker color. We will see some of that purple in it, but it's going to be dark. And if I keep mixing all these colors together, I actually end up with black. So what that means for negative colors, these are called, ones where we're actually absorbing things and then just getting back what's left. We tend to develop our primaries by looking at colors that only block one cone, ones that shine back pretty much everything except red, or shine back everything except green, or everything except blue, which means what we're getting back are things that do fire strongly on the other two. So our negative primaries actually end up being the colors that fall directly between the normal light primaries. So the light primaries are red, green, and blue. But when we're mixing inks, we actually want to work with yellow, cyan, and magenta, because each of those, yellow is going to show us green and red very strongly. Magenta is going to show us red and blue very strongly. So if I mix the yellow and the magenta, I end up blocking out the cyan tones very, very effectively, and I end up seeing that as red. So if you've ever wondered why your computer and all of your web design requires RGB color, but your printer uses CMYK ink cartridges, the K for black, this is the reason why. It's because your monitor is using light, projecting light directly at you, but your printer is using ink that absorbs colors that you don't see. So that's just some background on how colors work, and it kind of puts us in a good frame of mind to start talking about how we measure color. So in order to measure color, we need some color system. And typically, the way that these color systems start is with a set of primaries. We say, you know what? I'm going to define everything in terms of some red, green, and blue component here for us on a computer. And when we do that, what we end up with is actually defining sort of a triangle of visible light. We can't actually capture every single color using just 3 specific frequencies, but by mixing them in different proportions, we can get your cones in your eye to fire different amounts and kind of emulate what those colors would look like if we actually shown that frequency at you directly. If you've ever wondered why it is that certain digital lights, looking at white light from a TV or a computer screen can give you a headache after a long time, but being outdoors doesn't necessarily feel the same, that's part of why. It's because we actually have very, very few frequencies. We select just 3 that we're working with, and then we're mixing them to kind of recreate what the eye would naturally observe in full spectrum light. So we end up finding one of these color spaces here, get all of the colors that can represent, and then we have a choice to make. Somehow we have to actually specify coordinates in this color space. I have to say, well, I don't just want the red or the green or the blue. I actually want to mix the blue frequency and the red frequency together. I want this kind of magenta fuchsia color down here. So there's two ways we can do this. The easy way is just by specifying some proportion of each of these. Literally say, here's an amount of red, here's an amount of green, here's an amount of blue, mix them together. If you've used a color hex code, that's exactly what you're doing. Hashtag 2 digits of red, 2 digits of green, 2 digits of blue, mix them in this amount. The other way that we could do this is by talking about the polar coordinates of these things. We could say, you know what? I'm going to position my 3 primaries across from each other on the color wheel. I've got my green shade here, my red shade here, my blue shade here. Remember, we said the color kind of ends up being a triangle if we pick these different locations in color space with frequency. I can just put them on a triangle or map that triangle to a circle. I've now got a circle here, and then I can just talk about degrees of the circle. I'll set 0 to be the left side, as you usually do in math, and then say, okay, go 30 degrees around the circle, 60, 90, go all the way up to 180 is halfway around the circle. Go back to 359 is this maroon edging very, very close into red. Did at 360, I'm back at the start again. Now I've put my color on a wheel, and there's something very, very elegant about this. With mixing systems, it's hard to kind of intuit what the relationship is between two colors. You have to figure out the ratios to say, oh, well, you know, is RGB 100 red, 70 green, 30 blue? What color is that actually? You have to figure out the proportions of these things to each other and then add them together, figure out something about the total magnitude to figure out how bright or dark it's going to be. With the color wheel, I can immediately tell you, oh, well, it's at 0. It's going to be some shade of red. I don't know if it's light red, dark red, but anything with a 0 in it is a red. Anything with a 180 in it is going to be a green because it's opposite red here. It lets me really easily identify different hues of color. The only problem is we've lost something in this. We only have the ability to talk about hue. We need to add back in dimensions that let us say how saturated something is, how much chroma it has, as well as how light or dark the final result is, the lightness or the tint. If we do that, we actually end up with what's called the Munsell color system, sometimes referred to as HSL or HSV color if you're from the 90s. In Munsell color, HSL color, we've got 3 components. The hue, or the H, which is where we are on the color wheel. Then we've got the saturation, how much it's fully that color, how much it's leached out to a gray or white or black. And then we've got lightness, that L value, which says, well, how bright or dark is this color? So there are some very big benefits to using HSL color. The biggest benefit is that it makes it really, really, really easy to mathematically describe color palettes. So with our color, very rarely when we're building a website do we just use one color, say, yep, here's my green, I've picked my green, that's it, I'm done. Normally, we like to create palettes, much like an artist's palette, you know, holding up that slab of wood with all these little paints mixed in it. When we're building our website, we want a variety of different colors that we can choose from. And a big decision we have to make is which of these colors are we going to use? We don't want to use hundreds of them. We really only want to pick 5 or 6 different colors that kind of give us the feel that we're looking for. There are several ways that we can pick these. I'm going to describe just a few of them. There are even more exotic color schemes that we're not going to get into, but this will give you enough of a baseline to start to reason about what does or doesn't look good. So the absolute simplest thing you can go with on a website is a monochromatic color palette. So monochromatic color refers to color palettes that use exactly one hue. So right here, we've got an example of a monochromatic palette. All of these colors that are visible here, if we actually go inspect this page, they're all hue 160. And all I've done is played with just the lightness. In web colors, you can use HSL parentheses and then put a hue, a saturation as a percentage, a lightness as a percentage, and you end up getting a color at that position on the Munsell color wheel. All of these are 160, but this dark green is a low lightness 160. This very light green, almost mint color is a very high lightness 160. And these colors naturally are going to complement one another. There is an important note, which is you do not want to wash your entire page with this. You don't want the entire background to be this very high chroma color, and then your text is this very high chroma light green. That's going to be very homogeneous feeling. It's going to be kind of give this perception that things are not well separated on your website. Typically, when you have some information dense main content area, you want that to be a very neutral color. So this is going to be something low saturation and either very high or very low lightness. It doesn't have to be white or black. It can be white or black, but you can also use an off-white or an off-black. You know, just go with 10% chroma and 80%, 85% lightness. It'll give you that still feeling of being in the same color, but it's going to feel much more neutral. It's not going to distract from the page. And then you use these very high vibrancy colors, things with full chroma, full saturation, as emphasis for titles, for borders, for little focal points like call to action buttons. If you want to take a monochromatic color scheme to the next level, you can even incorporate grays, start creating contrast where you have a lot of very, very muted tones for things that are going to take up larger amounts of space. And then you have your high vibrancy tones as accents, little markers like a small line under the header or something like that. One of the benefits of doing this is it makes it much easier to create visual distance between your colors. That's something that's very important in all of these palettes, is you don't want any two colors very close to each other. When you have colors that are very close but not quite the same, it looks sort of like the person who dressed themselves and couldn't quite tell that they were wearing two slightly different shades of blue. If you've got two colors that are that close, you might as well just use the same one. We're on a computer where we can get things exact. And if you're using some grays in your palette, that opens up the room to have very dark and very light colors that feel more distant from one another. Each color has a stronger identity in this palette. So that's a monochromatic color scheme, and sort of some of the ways we can play with it, the ways we could use it. If we want to branch out from there, the next simplest scheme we can look at is an analogous scheme. So in an analogous color scheme, we start exactly like a monochromatic scheme where we choose one home base hue. Here in this one, my home base hue is 270. These three boxes in the front, they are all hue 270, just with lightness and saturation played with. But then you branch out in the analogous color scheme and choose colors that are 30 degrees apart on either side of your home base. So my home base is this violet color here. If I wrap around to 300, I end up with this pinkish mauve color. If I go back to 240, I get this nice blue. So much like our monochromatic scheme, analogous color schemes have a very unified look. But we've just got a little bit of extra variety. It's sort of like when we introduced the muted, lower saturation tones with our monochromatic scheme, injecting in these accent tones that are 30 degrees apart gives us a little bit more to play with if we do want not just one color appearing on our website. So that number 30 isn't chosen randomly. Remember, we said we don't want to pick colors that are immediately next to one another. You can get away with that if you are heavily modifying the saturation and the lightness. But generally, we want just enough to be a step away. It's sort of like in musical notes. Sound is also frequency based, and if you have a sliding pitch, something going boo, you're hitting every single frequency. But in music, we don't do that. We don't usually play the slide whistle. Instead, we choose set notes that are enough distance apart that we can really tell they're distinct. Our 30 degrees here is sort of our half step note. It is enough that this blue looks different than this purple, looks different than this pink here. Like I said, these are rules, and rules are always made to be broken. But if you want something that gives you a little bit of variety, but still feels very unified, analogous schemes are a great way to mathematically build out a palette of colors that works for that. Now, our next kind of scheme is one of those examples of a way that we can break the rules. So, conventional wisdom in art is that you never put complementary colors next to each other. Complementary colors are two colors that appear opposite on the color wheel. So they're going to be 180 degrees apart. If we inspect our orange and blue here, we see the orange is at 30, the blue is at 120. 180 plus 30 gets us, or 210, sorry. 180 plus 30 gets us to 210. These are as far apart as they can be. And if we look, it is very, very visually noisy. These two colors, I almost feel the clash, the dissonance vibrating off of them. Sort of like when you hear two notes a half step apart and you're playing them at the same time and there's this ringing in your ears. However, if we take those same exact hues and we heavily modify the saturation and the lightness, we can reestablish some of that distance. We can say, well, you know what? My orange here, this is going to be my base tone. This is going to be my home base. And I'm going to try to drain some of the heat out of that color. I'm going to force it to be a dark tone. So saturation down, lightness down. We end up with brown if you do that. So here we've got a couple nice browns, almost like sandy beach colors. And then for the blue, I'm going to take some of that energy I took out of the orange and inject it into that blue. I'm going to make the blue even lighter, keep it saturated, but lift it up so that it feels very far apart from the orange that turned into brown here. If we do that, we basically end up with the colors of the beach, a nice light blue sky, some earthy sandy tones, and those don't clash nearly as much. If I saw them next to each other, there is still an interplay between them. There is still a lot of contrast here. But that contrast doesn't feel as dissonant. So these complementary color schemes are very, very effective when you're basically using it like a monochromatic scheme. You're living on this home base here. And then your focal point, your call to action, or your donation button, or your subscribe button is in that contrasting complement, because the eye will immediately be drawn directly to that complementary color. That play between the opposites is still there. You immediately look at that opposite and say, whoa, wait, what is that? But it doesn't clash the same way that it does if both of these things are high chroma. So that is an effective way to use complementary colors. One trick here is always have your complement, have your color away from home base be your high saturation, high chroma color. And as we'll talk about with our tips in a minute, it also helps to pick the naturally brighter color for this. Something like a yellow or a lime or a cyan are really, really good as attention grabbers. Works as well for other colors. You can tweak blue up to be very vibrant, but a very vibrant blue is still going to be less powerful than a even less saturated cyan. But I have seen so many websites in my career that basically use a scheme exactly like this. They say, okay, you know what? My main content area will be white. It won't be completely saturated, awash with all these colors. All of my banner images, my navigation bar, my headers, my borders, they're going to be these nice, rich blue tones. Opposite of blue, 180 degrees across, is yellow. I'm going to make a very, very, very bright, vibrant yellow as my accent, as my call to action button. This is hugely popular. These exact colors show up on dozens of websites. And like I said, this type of design is most effective when we're using it because we really, really want people to pay attention to this thing. The thing that we choose to make yellow is the point of our website. It's where people need to look. There is one other way to use complementary colors, and that is by combining the concept of complements with the concept of analogs. So our analogs are the colors that are 30 degrees away on either side. If we take a home base and then go across from that, but don't go and stay directly across, but instead jump, split 30 degrees to either side, what we end up with is what's called a split complement scheme. And a split complement scheme keeps a lot of the contrast that we saw with our direct complements. It has that energy between the warm colors and the cool colors, but it doesn't clash nearly as badly. Remember, we said 30 degrees is just enough space that colors feel distinct, so we're no longer at that point where we're triggering the exact opposite set of cones that we were before. That's a lot of what makes these complements noisy, is you're doing the exact opposite thing with the cones. You've got your blue cone on one color and you've got the green and red cone making the yellow on the other color. So those two things right next to each other, they really want to be white, but none of them are white, so your brain is struggling to process it. When you split and make a split complement, a lot of that dissonance goes away. So you get to keep this high energy color palette, but it doesn't clash nearly as badly. And that lets us play more with chroma, keep more things brightly colored. You know, if you do want to keep a very light website or a very dark website, something like a split complement is a good tool to help you do that and not have to play with contrast quite as much. I will still say contrast is very effective. Having very, very bright tones, very, very dark tones, the interplay between them really helps focus the eye and create hard lines without having to draw out those hard lines. But These are a couple different ways that we can define color palettes to get us to something that looks very good without even needing to check. If you use these rules and HSL color, you can be pretty sure it will look at least okay before you even refresh the page. And that's really the goal of this video, is to help you start thinking about color, not as something that you do by trial and error. We shouldn't be constantly checking because monitors display colors differently. People even have differences in their eye. People have weakness in one of their cones causing partial color blindness. We want to make sure that the colors that we've chosen look good for pretty much everyone, and using these mathematical principles is one way to do that. That said, there are just a couple other tips I have for you related to how we can use color effectively. And most of what they boil down to is that the colors we pick aren't all that's important. Also, where we use them has a huge impact. So in general, any high saturation color is going to create visual noise. If you are making your entire web page bright blue, that's going to distract from whatever text you've got. So for information dense areas like your main text area, like places that have figures in front of a background, like the point of your website, something like where your big video is with the theater of margin around it, you're going to want those areas not to be using vibrant colors. You're going to want to use neutral colors there to avoid distracting your user. Like I said, most websites are going to have their main content area be white, black, very, very light gray, very, very dark gray, or even a shaded color that's a very light almost gray or a very dark almost gray. That's just what most of your website should be. Otherwise, it's going to distract from people. In fact, anything that isn't white or black already is going to look very artistic, more like a presentation than a website that's conveying information. So that's your first tip, is color should be used sparingly. Next, as long as you're picking two colors in your palette that are not too close together, you can get away with a lot. Just like musical notes that are dissonant because they're too close, colors that are only 4 or 5 degrees apart on the color wheel, there is natural dissonance there. As long as you're choosing things from different sections of the wheel, as long as you are making some very light, some very dark, some very saturated, some almost gray, you have a lot of room to play with colors that might even be intentionally dissonant, like we saw with our complementary colors, while still making something that's visually cohesive. So that's your second tip, is just don't pick things that are too close to each other. Like we said, it's like someone who didn't quite match their clothes. In that case, just pick the same color. There's no reason for a second color anyway. Like we said, the best tool we have to create space between colors that would otherwise clash is working with lightness and saturation. If you have complementary colors, if you have colors that are close in hue, lightness and saturation covers a lot of mistakes. It covers a lot of missteps. You really don't want your entire website being completely saturated. If everything on your page is just set to 100 saturation, unless you're using a lot of white or black to balance that out, it's going to feel like opening a Crayola box. It's going to be very hard to kind of get your bearings on that website. On the other hand, if everything on your website is dark, nothing goes above 25% lightness anywhere on the page, first, you're not going to be able to read the text. But second, it's going to feel very, very muted, very dark. Even just a single little accent, something like our little yellow bar right here, can help focus the eye, can create a sense of balance. it makes it so all of this text on the right has almost the same visual weight as this narrow little line on the left here. You're going to want to play with contrast and try to keep contrast high. Use both ends of your spectrum and only use that area in the middle for accents, for things that actually are focal points. The next tip I have for you is match your assets. Normally, websites have photos, they have giant splash banner pages above the fold. Take that image, identify what are the colors that show up again and again and again, and that may already give you your home base hue. If I have a giant picture of this beautiful aspen forest, there's going to be a lot of green in that. There's going to be a lot of brown, a little bit of blue. I might already have identified tones I want to work with from there. I might say, well, you know what? Maybe I don't know how to make that brown work. I'm going to select the green as my home base color, maybe incorporate a few grays from the rock, identify, well, let me take that sky, crank it up to be a very, very light blue, and already you're at the start of a good color scheme there. Especially for large images above the fold, make sure your images match the rest of your website. This isn't always possible. The news can't really choose what color shirt the speaker that they're photographing decided to wear, and they're not going to completely change their branding every single time a new headline puts a giant splash of color on their website. But if you've got something like a portfolio, if you've got something like a website for a company, a website for a organization, a park, something like that where the content is fairly static, either choose your colors from your images or choose images that fit your colors. If you decide, you know what, this is going to be a tan and brown website with a blue complementary color as a focal point, like we said, that sounds like the beach. I bet I can find a picture of sand and waves that's going to perfectly match colors in a mathematically sound color palette. And that would be a really effective choice for my fold image. So that is the next tip, is just match your assets. And then finally, this last tip is kind of a secret rule, one that's a little bit less well defined than the rest. It's called the Mueller rule. It actually did not encode correctly in Unicode. It's the U with the double dot above it. But the Mueller rule says that when you're in doubt on selecting which color from a palette you want to be the home base, it's generally more visually pleasing to play to the natural lightness of color. So what I mean by that is, if we go back and look at our cones in our eye, there are some colors that are going to register very, very brightly in the eye. Yellow is basically right at the intersection of our medium and long cones. So yellow clocks in as very high energy in your eye. Something like violet, it's kind of at the end of your short cone. It's going to be picked up very darkly. It's going to feel rich, deep, complex. And even if you try to crank violet up to 100%, you're not going to end up with a very, very bright color. At best, you can make it light and faded, but there just isn't a high energy violet color. If you're choosing one to be an accent, because they're about 180 degrees apart on the color wheel, yellow is going to make a more effective accent there than trying to make your whole website muted shades of dark brown and then try to make a very vibrant violet call to action button. You can still do it. There are ways to do it, especially if you're working kind of light and then you use the darkness of the violet to its advantage. That can work, but what is not going to look nearly as good is cranking up colors that don't want to be cranked up. We've talked about HSL a lot in this video. There is actually another color system that works on the same exact principle as HSL. You define a hue, you define a saturation or chroma, and you define a lightness value. But in this other system, what's called OKLCH color, they actually try to balance out that natural lightness. They try to say, you know what? 40 chroma is going to be the exact same energy, the same visual noise for every hue. If we do that, if I say, you know what, I want this much lightness, this much chroma, you can see on our hue bar here, these all feel like they play together. They feel very, very similar in hue. If I did just a normal HSL hue bar, the violet's going to be much darker, the cyan's going to be much brighter, the yellowish color is going to be actually like bright yellow. But there is a consequence of this. In OKLCH color, notice on the chroma 2D grid here, not every color is actually representable. There's this very high peak of chroma on green. If I come over to green, I can set the chroma, the saturation, to be very, very high. If I tried to do that same saturation, there does not exist a blue that meets that same spec. Blue is all the way down here. This is the most vibrant I can make a blue. Where these peaks occur, if we look, they're exactly at the intersection of two of our cones. Our greenish cone here and our red cone here, they combine and they give us this very bright color. The blue cone and the red cone combine and give us this magenta that otherwise doesn't even exist. This tells us where high energy colors can be found, either directly on a cone or directly between two cones. Those are the colors that, if you're looking for an accent, are going to be natural choices. On the other hand, if you're looking for colors to choose as darker colors, the ones that are kind of in the troughs between them, they're going to be very good choices for that. This also gives me an excuse to show you OKLCH color, which is a very, very intuitive color system. Makes it really easy to say, well, you know what? I actually want to swap from orange to purple, but I want things to stay around the same brightness. If you define your color like this, you're going to end up with a color palette where it's very easy to mathematically say, hey, you know what? I'm taking the hue here. I'm going to flip everything, reverse it by 180 degrees, and it will still look visually about the same. But that is my last tip, is just play to the natural strengths of the colors that you're working with. But hopefully this video has given you a couple tricks to think about when you are designing your websites. We talked about how light is actually perceived, what that means in terms of mixing colors, and how light and pigments behave a little bit differently here. We looked at different color systems, ways that we can choose hues to mix together to give us different available colors to choose from. How instead of mixing, we can talk about a color wheel and some of the benefits that that provides with our Munsell color HSL color system. And then we looked at several palettes, monochromatic palettes, analogous palettes, complementary palettes, split complement palettes, different techniques to select hues and then play with chroma and lightness in predictable ways. So hopefully this makes you as interested in color as I am. It's one of my favorite topics in web design, especially when implemented in conjunction with our Gestalt rules and our design rules of composition. You can use color to make some very, very effective websites. So that is it for color. In our next videos, we are going to be looking at some other areas of web design. So look forward to that, and I will catch you all in the next one.